But before doing that, I want to talk about the three possible scenarios where we could end up. You talked about one of them, which is deflating the currency. The dollar's already down 10% so far this year. That's the worst start of a year in 5 decades. Bond yields have gone up from 3.8 to 4.5%. So it seems very gradual. Now, that's option one. Now, Ray, again, I'm going to refer back to Ray Dalio. You talked about two other possible scenarios. Number two is domestic unrest. People stop trusting the institution, populist movement. And a third one, which is war, something people don't like to talk about, but that forces the government to essentially distract the voters away from domestic problem, rally the nationalistic sentiment, and rally the economy as well. Now, this is more long-term discussion, looking at historically what's happened to other empires falling or when a country's or an empire or countries heavily indebted. What do you think of these three scenarios? Is there any other scenarios? And scenario 2 and 3 seem pretty pessimistic, but are there something that should be discussed at this stage?
Yeah, I don't know if people consciously go to war to escape domestic problems. Does it happen? Sure. Is there always a danger of getting more involved in war? Sure there is. I mean, the dangers now, there's a danger of being involved more with the Israel and Iran war. There's danger of being involved more with the Russia and Ukraine war as well. And I think continuing to speak about directing our attention towards our domestic problems and knowing that we don't have enough money. I tell people, look, yeah, sure, Russia was the aggressor. Russia invaded Ukraine. All of the moral arguments are for Ukraine. But what about the argument that in order to fight a war, in order for us to fund a war and to arm Ukraine, we have to borrow the money from China to fund Ukraine? It's the same sort of thing if people say, well, what about the poor people in sub-Saharan Africa? Don't you care? Why don't we help them? I say, well, you can help them if you have a surplus, but we would have to go to the bank to borrow. And to me, it's sort of the equivalent of you're walking down the street and you make $25,000 a year and you can barely pay your rent and you have no extra money, and you see a homeless person and you have a great deal of sympathy and you say, well, gosh, I should go to the first bank and borrow $1,000 to give to the homeless person. Nobody thinks that way. But essentially, that's what we are now. We are full of a lot of people on both sides of the aisle with a great deal of sympathy. The hawks want to fund war. The left wants to fund welfare, the warfare welfare state. And what we're stuck with is people that just are putting us further and further into debt. In fact, the big, what I call not so beautiful bill was really not so much about, the tax cuts. That was a big part of it. But a lot of it was a way to get around the military caps. These were the hawks who said, we want more money for the military. This is how we can do it without giving more welfare for the Democrats. We'll get more warfare. And then we'll also have a ton of money plowed into a standing army that we're going to hire for the Customs and Border Patrol. And it was really a spending bill. In the end, the bill spent over $500 billion in new money. And then they're surprised that it actually will add to the deficit. Literally, there was $500 billion or more in new spending in that bill. And, none of it really offset in the first 5 years. Even the most optimistic estimates from the authors of the bill were that it would add about $500 billion to the debt in the first 5 years. And that's with an optimistic estimate. The CBO predicted even more.
In terms of the bill, I'll try to play devil's advocate to try to understand the other perspective, because I was really excited when Trump got elected and Elon with Doge. It's like, finally the US is addressing its debt. But then this bill and seeing the split between Trump and Elon, it started getting me to doubt that. But I'm going to give a perspective from an economist. His name is Daniel Lacal, who's a libertarian. And, we had a discussion about the bill to get his perception of it. And he was a lot more optimistic. And he said the following: in an ideal world, we'd pass a $2 trillion cut, but that's not politically viable. This is the best achievable outcome under the system we have. What system is he referring to? And do you think, as much as you hate the bill, could he be accurate there? Like, it seems impossible to get anything better to pass. And the bill does have pretty significant cuts in mandatory spending, $1.7 trillion, I think, over 10 years, through Medicaid, work requirements, structural reforms as well, entitlement reforms. So there are cuts there. he says it's a step in the right direction. It's not perfect. He'd love to see more cuts. But as a libertarian as well, he's happy with the tax cuts, which could also, there's the argument that the tax cut could lead to economic growth. And that helps reduce the debt as well.
Well, what I would say, as far as it couldn't be much better, is, well, we could have started out by not spending $500 billion in new spending. If you simply codified the tax cuts and had some savings, that changes the complexion of the bill completely. But the people wanted the bill because they wanted a spending bill. That's why it's not fiscally conservative. They wanted $150 billion for the military, $150 billion for the border. Then they threw in some sweeteners, another $70 billion for agricultural subsidies, another $50 billion for hospitals. Everybody got a sweetener. You got to get the people on the fence on the border. We had to sweeten it up. But they're really, I can give you one example of something that we should have done that would have transformed it from a spending bill to an actual savings bill. Obamacare, one of the big aspects of Obamacare was expanding Medicaid. Republicans, the Republican universe of voters, as well as politicians, they were all against Obamacare. They said repeal Obamacare. Well, it never happened, but in this bill, there was a chance that we could have at least capped or ended a program where the federal government pays for virtually all of the new people on Medicaid. The Medicaid expansion people, when Obamacare started, the federal government paid 100%. And so it's like all these states said, oh, wow, it's free. The federal government's going to pay 100% of all these new people. I'll put all these people, I'll give them all free health care, something for nothing. The government will pay 100%. After a few years, it reverted to where the federal government pays 90%. But let's say we just said no more people get it at 90%. No limitations on Medicaid. Nobody gets kicked off Medicaid. We simply say that the new people will get it at the traditional split, which is the states pay about half, and the federal government pays about half. That would save $800 to $900 billion over 10 years, and you'd have a real savings bill. But the person you're referring to says, oh, 1.7 trillion in savings. Well, divide by 10, that's 170 billion. So the deficit this year is going to be 2.2 trillion. With this massive cut of 1.7 trillion over 10, you're looking at taking the deficit from 2.2 trillion to 2.0 trillion. I mean, you're looking at a rounding error. People are not getting how enormous the problem is. The administration has sent us a rescission package. This is where they send us spending already approved. They send it back to approve cutting it. They sent us $9 billion. That means that the deficit would go from being 2.2 trillion to 2.191 trillion. It's a rounding error. People don't realize that you can't do anything with any of the deficit unless you look at every dollar. And that's the only way to do it without dramatically eliminating things. It also brings people together. For example, let's say you had a liberal on this program and they said, I can't vote to cut all of NPR's money. And you say, well, how about 6%? If they're a reasonable person, they might actually say, let's say they're for Alzheimer's research. And you say, well, we're out of money. Could you cut 6%? That's why across the board actually works better, because everybody that wants something from government loses a little bit. Instead, what we're doing with the rescission package, which I will support, is 100% of NPR, but there won't be one Democrat or liberal person who's for that. Ultimately, the consensus will be when you get everybody together and you say, well, the right wants military stuff, the left wants welfare, warfare and welfare. Maybe instead of compromising to raise both, we compromise to reduce both. And you spread the cuts across the entire bandwidth of the dollar spent, so it doesn't have to be as dramatic anymore. I test this all the time. People come into my office. There's a week a year where they come in with the purple ribbons on. They're there for Alzheimer's. I have a great deal of sympathy. I have family members with Alzheimer's disease. And yet, I ask them, often they're with their family member who has Alzheimer's. There's people emotionally involved in this research. And I say, look, you guys got 100 million last year and we're out of money. Would you be okay if we gave you 94 million next year? Not a person says no, not one. But if I offer that to anybody in Washington, Republican or Democrat, they'll say, you will be skewered, you will be hung out to dry. That's a third rail. We could never cut Alzheimer's research. And, that's kind of where we are. But I don't think it's realistic to say we got as much as we could get. The reform I talked about, capping the Obamacare expansion and going back to the states paying half of Medicaid and the federal government paying half, kicks no one off of Medicaid, but saves $1 trillion, nearly $1 trillion. That's the least we should have done in this. The work requirements may help some, but it's really unpredictable. It's 10 years out, and we'll find out whether they did or didn't. They add paper requirements to get people to tell you whether they're working or what, and hopefully the states will police it and people will leave. But I'm not convinced that over time that all the cuts actually pan out. Most of the predictions for cuts are in the second 5 years, and most of the predictions for the spending, which are real because they will spend the money, are in the first couple of years.
The proposition you've just made now just sounds very reasonable. As a business person, if I want to cut costs, and we do that every year depending on market conditions, cutting costs across the board so each department understands that we have to do this across the board, no one leaves, no one feels like they're being targeted, makes logical sense. What's the reaction in Washington? Why aren't they implementing this, at least as a starting point?
On the Democrat side, they don't believe there's a need to cut money yet. They believe in the modern monetary theory that there are no limits to borrowing and we can borrow as much as we want. There really is not hesitancy yet on the Democrat side. On the Republican side, there is some pretense to believing that the debt is wrong, but they believe, and the president has convinced them that it's a third rail, that you can't talk about, Social Security's taken off the table, Medicare is taken off the table, and then essentially Medicaid was even being taken off the table by the administration. Once you do that, there's not a whole lot left. To put it in perspective, the dynamics of what the budget is like, we bring in $5 trillion in revenue, we spend $7 trillion. So that's the mismatch. $5 trillion comes in, $7 trillion goes out. The $5 trillion that comes in is consumed by the entitlements, virtually all of it, even before you get to the budget that we actually vote on. So when you hear Congress has voted on a budget, it's about a $2 trillion budget. It's all borrowed because Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and other welfare programs have sucked up the entire $5 trillion. So when I vote on a budget, yes or no, on the military and non-military discretionary spending, that budget, it's all borrowed. So you could zero out the entire budget we vote on, and that would just barely get you to balance. But nobody's for that. Nobody's for zeroing out. And really, I'm not either. I don't want to zero out the military budget, but I certainly would have a real cut to the military budget across the board with everything else, and we'd survive. We spend more in the military than the next 10 countries combined. So there is room for savings everywhere. But Democrats are not yet ready for that. They are not worried or alarmed enough about the deficit, and the Republicans are still too fearful to do it. And so if I had to predict, like if you were an investor and I was telling you, what do you do? What's going to happen? Is Congress going to come to its way, or will there be a continued problem? I would say that the dollar will continue to decline. We will continue to inflate our way, and that it either happens gradually or suddenly. And there is still a distinct possibility of a sudden downturn. I think the tariffs add a degree of uncertainty to it. The discussion recently of 50% tariffs on copper, going back to 40 and 50% tariffs. This would be something beyond what we've ever seen in the marketplace. And people say, well, so far, so good. The tariffs really have not been in place long enough or consistently enough. Most of these have been held in abeyance. And as they come to fruition, I think what you could see is that added to the uncertainty with the dollar and the debt, you could see a calamity like we have not seen in recent history.
Do you worry that the US is in a kind of a death cycle? So essentially, and it leads to voters leaning more socialist, unintentionally becoming reliant on the government. So what we're seeing right now is the dollar being weakened, that inflation rises, people start to seek more governmental support. That leads to the government increasing its debt. That then leads